Hi there, this is Eric for Ochoy. In this video, we're going to talk about working with the metallic material in Octane for Maya. And for this video, I'm using the Octane Materials 01 scene. So in this scene, I have my four spheres. So I have a diffuse material applied to this sphere, glossy on this one, specular on this one, metallic on this one. And then our little sci-fi element here in the background, I have a mixed material that's combining a glossy and a metallic material. So I'm going to select the sphere with the metallic material, press F to zoom in, and go into the attribute editor for the Octane Metallic Material tab. Let's take a look at the settings. So the settings that I'm going to talk about in this video are the ones that directly influence how the metallic material is calculated in your scene. So a lot of the settings that are shared between this material and glossy and specular, I'm going to skip for this video just to keep it nice and short, because we've already discussed them in the other videos. So things like roughness, anisotropy, and bump and normal and opacity and so on. I'm going to skip those and focus on the most important settings, which are diffuse, specular, and specular map, as well as the different types of index of refraction and the ways you can calculate it down here. So starting with diffuse, the diffuse channel actually doesn't do a whole lot initially with the metallic material. If I click on this checkerboard icon and bring up the Create Render Node window, I'm going to add an RGB spectrum texture here and change the color to like this bright orange or yellow. And you can see when I do that, we don't have any change right here. That's because the metallic material doesn't have a strong diffuse component. It's mostly defined by its specular reflections and how it reflects light back into the scene. However, you can use the diffuse channel when you want to kind of separate the parts of the model into parts that are metallic or parts that are non-metallic. So if you're doing like some kind of paint or paint splotches or something like that, you can use a texture map to kind of control that. So typically if you're using a texturing program such as Substance, you might paint a metallic map, which is a grayscale map that basically says, you know, on the light parts, make it metallic, on the dark parts, make it non-metallic, and gray sort of in between. So if I go down here to specular map, I'm going to click on this checkerboard icon, pull up the Create Render Node window, and click on the checks texture. And when I do that, you can see we get that yellow color here in the non-metallic parts and our reflections here on the metallic parts. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get over to working with this structure right here. But that gives you just a brief explanation of how diffuse works, or is meant to work, with the metallic material. So I'm going to break the connection here and here. We have the specular slider, which goes from 0 to 1, 0 being black and 1 being white. So that controls the color of the specular reflections. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we also have our BRDF model, our roughness, and anisotropy. And again, if anisotropy doesn't seem to be doing anything, we can switch to Beckman or GGX, and then force Maya to update the render view by clicking on this script button, the shelf button that I created in the glossy material video. So let's talk about the metallic reflection mode, which is a menu that gives you three different choices for how you want to calculate the index of refraction and any tint that you might have on the highlights or the reflections in the surface. A tinted reflection is what tends to make metal surfaces look metallic. But there are several different ways that you can calculate this depending on whether you want something that is artistic or something that is more physically accurate or even something in between. So if we take a look at this menu here, we have artistic, IOR plus color, and RGB IOR. So in artistic is not physically accurate. It's just meant to give you an option for creating something that looks appealing without necessarily having to worry about the physics of light. So if I set metallic reflection mode to artistic and start plugging in a number into these fields, we don't see anything happening. I set 2.8 or 500 or 1,000, doesn't matter. We get nothing. The artistic mode basically means that the specular color, which you can find this slot way up here at the top above specular map, is what's going to control the color of the specular highlights on the surface. So if I click on the checkerboard icon here, and let's pull up RGB spectrum texture, and we'll set this to sort of a yellowish orange. we get this look. This could be RGB or it could be a grayscale map. Now, if we set the menu to IOR plus color, and I'm going to keep that yellow map here in the specular channel, what this means is that now the index of refraction is going to be controlled by these two fields plus the color map that you've added to the specular color. So if I set IOR to 2.8, you can see any value that is above 1, we're going to get some reflections in here as we raise the index of refraction. So 2.8, fairly high value. We see the color coming into the specular highlights, but we're also able to use a physically accurate index of refraction. So for example, if you go to a website like Pixel and Poly, they have a nice list of the index of refraction for various materials here. So take a look at bronze here. This is 1.180. So let's plug that into our index of refraction. So we're still having this yellow color control the specular color, but this is the index of refraction, and if we want to change the intensity of the Fresnel effect, we can use this second slot right here. So if I set this to 2, you can see we get a much brighter metal. So without getting too much into the weeds about it, these two fields represent the N and K value for calculating how a light is reflected off of the surface. So N stands for index of refraction. The second value, K value, to put it simply, is essentially the extinction coefficient, and it controls sort of the accuracy of the Fresnel effect on the metal. So you can use it to raise or lower the intensity of the reflections on the surface. So these three things work together when you're using IOR plus color. So think of these modes as being artistic, as being completely artistic and not necessarily physically accurate. IOR plus color is kind of like a happy medium. And then RGB IOR is the physically accurate way to calculate the index of refraction for a metallic surface. You can see when I switch to RGB IOR, we get this blue tint to it, and that's because I have values plugged into these fields right here. So let's set these back to 0. So when using the RGB IOR mode, each one of these fields represent different wavelengths of light. So red at the top, green in the middle, and blue at the bottom. This should be labeled red, but that label has been left off, probably because it will get too confusing if you're using these other two modes. So RGB IOR is the only mode that uses all of these different settings: red, green, and blue. So in order to find the correct values to plug into here, we need to go to a website. That website is refractiveindex.info. And here you'll find information on the correct N and K values for a wide variety of materials. Let's choose something simple. Let's choose gold. So if I click on main and then go down to book, I'm going to choose gold right here. And then the next thing I need to do is plug in a value here for the red, green, and blue wavelengths. So this requires a little bit of memorization, but it's not too bad. The correct wavelength value for red is going to be 0.65. 0.65, whoops, there we go, 0.65. This will give us N and K values. N value is 0.15557, K value is 3.6024. So let's plug those in. We'll do 0.15557, 3.6024. Not much of a change just yet. So next, let's take a look at the wavelength for green, which is going to be 0.55. So we get 0.42415, 2.4721. Let's plug those in. 0.42415, 2.4721. Finally, we need the value for the blue wavelength, and we're going to get that by plugging in 0.45. And we get 1.3831 and 1.9155. Let's plug those in. 1.3831, 1.9155. So now what you could do, we can break the connection here for the specular map. You see, if I start to increase or decrease the specular slider, nothing happens. Everything is being controlled down here using these values. So we could also change, you know, the intensity of this. Let's say we wanted to kind of darken this a little bit. We can start to mess with some of these values here to kind of fine tune the look of it. But it depends on how married you are to physically accurate materials in your particular scene. But the nice thing is that you have a bunch of different ways to approach creating metallic surfaces all within the same material. So that's the main benefit of using these different methods for calculating the index of refraction. So that covers the basics of working with the metallic material. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the mixed material, and we'll come back and revisit some of these settings up here like specular and specular map as we create a material for the metallic bits of this structure right here.